The cruelest mistakes are the ones people make when they think they already know who you are. Eleanor Hayes arrived 12 minutes before the funeral began, stepping out of a city bus 2 blocks from St. Mark's Chapel with a handbag so worn at the corners it looked older than some of the mourners inside. A cold November wind moved through downtown Chicago, tugging at her charcoal coat as she stood across the street and looked up at the stone church where black sedans lined the curb like a silent parade of privilege. Richard Langford's name was displayed beside the entrance in polished brass, and beneath it, a framed portrait showed the familiar smile that had once dominated magazine covers, business journals, and television interviews. Billionaire, philanthropist, visionary, beloved patriarch, according to the floral display arranged outside. Eleanor stared at the photo for a long second, then lowered her eyes and crossed the street. The moment she reached the chapel doors, a woman in a tailored black designer coat stepped directly into her path. Victoria Langford did not bother hiding the slow, dismissive glance from Eleanor's shoes to her face. "Family only," she said, with the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. Eleanor met her gaze calmly. "I know." Victoria gave a short laugh. "Then you're clearly confused." A younger man standing nearby snorted into his coffee. Another woman whispered something that triggered quiet laughter from the cluster behind her. Eleanor tightened her grip on the envelope in her hand, but said nothing. Victoria tilted her head. "Service staff entrance is around back." "I'm not staff," Eleanor replied softly. "Oh." Victoria crossed her arms. "Then what exactly are you?" Before Eleanor could answer, a man in his 40s approached, adjusting his expensive watch. Daniel Langford, Richard's eldest son. He looked Eleanor over with open suspicion. "Do we know her?" Victoria smirked. "Apparently she believes she belongs here." Daniel's expression hardened instantly. "This is a private family service." Eleanor nodded once. "I understand." "Then leave," Victoria said. But Eleanor didn't move. Not because she was stubborn. Because Richard had asked her not to. The memory of his voice still lived clearly in her mind, steady even in weakness. "Promise me you'll come, no matter what they say." Daniel stepped closer. "Look, if you're here about money, today isn't the day." Eleanor's face changed, not in anger, but in something quieter. Hurt, perhaps. "I'm not here for money." Victoria laughed openly now. That's usually what people say right before asking for some. More laughter. Eleanor could feel eyes gathering around her, strangers in black coats deciding her story before hearing a single word. A valet by the curb watched with awkward discomfort. A woman carrying flowers looked away. Daniel exhaled sharply. "Please don't make this difficult." Then the church doors opened behind them, and the family attorney, Margaret Cole, stepped out, scanning the entrance as if searching for someone. Her eyes landed on Eleanor. She stopped walking. For one strange second, her expression shifted into unmistakable recognition. Victoria noticed immediately. "Margaret," she called, relieved. "Perfect timing. We've got a situation." But Margaret didn't answer right away. She kept looking at Eleanor with a strange, unreadable stillness. Then she said, carefully, "No, I don't believe you do." Victoria blinked. "Excuse me." Margaret adjusted the folder in her hand. "The service is about to begin." Daniel gestured toward Eleanor. "Then maybe you can explain why she's here." Margaret's eyes moved briefly toward him, then back to Eleanor. "Miss Hayes is not preventing the service." Victoria's voice sharpened. "So you know her?" Margaret offered the smallest possible pause. "Yes." Silence settled over the entrance like a sudden weather shift. Victoria's confidence flickered for the first time. "And what exactly is she to Richard?" Eleanor looked down at the envelope in her hand. Margaret answered without hesitation. "That is not a conversation for the church steps." Then she opened the door wider and stepped aside. Not for Victoria. Not for Daniel. For Eleanor. Victoria's jaw tightened as Eleanor passed her without a word and entered the chapel, where the front rows glowed with polished wood and expensive grief. Eleanor chose the last pew instead. Alone. Quiet. Nearly invisible. But not entirely. Because from across the room, more than one person had started wondering the same thing. Who was the woman Richard Langford's attorney had just treated with respect no one else thought she deserved? The organ music began low and solemn, filling St. Mark's Chapel with the kind of carefully curated sorrow money often preferred, elegant, measured, never messy. Eleanor sat in the last pew with her hands folded over the worn envelope in her lap, her posture still and composed, but inside, her thoughts moved in restless circles. She had imagined this day, more than once during the past 3 months, but imagining it had done little to prepare her for the reality of being in the same room with people who had loved Richard only in the language of inheritance. Across the aisle, Victoria leaned toward a silver-haired woman in pearls and whispered something that caused both women to glance backward at Eleanor before hiding their smiles behind funeral programs. Daniel remained near the front row, checking his phone more often than grief should have allowed. A younger cousin in a black suit quietly asked another relative whether the will reading would happen immediately after the burial. Eleanor heard more than they realized. That was one thing about quiet people. Others often assumed silence meant absence. Margaret Cole sat near the front, her legal folder resting neatly beside her. She never looked back, but Eleanor had the strange comfort of knowing Margaret knew she was there. The minister spoke warmly about Richard's accomplishments, his business leadership, his generosity, his mentorship, his impact on the city. Every word was true, in a way. Yet Eleanor found herself waiting for one truth no one in that room would mention. Richard had hated being praised for the wrong reasons. Once, over coffee in a diner where no one recognized him, he had laughed and said, "People always celebrate the version of me that photographs well." Eleanor had smiled then, because it was one of the few moments he had sounded free. A soft rustle moved through the pews as the service continued. Daniel's teenage son looked bored. Victoria dabbed her eyes with a silk handkerchief, but somehow managed to scan the room between gestures. At one point, her gaze locked onto Eleanor again, sharp with irritation, as though the mere existence of an unexplained guest had become personally offensive. When the minister invited those closest to Richard to share memories, Daniel stood first. He spoke about discipline, excellence, standards, legacy. Victoria followed, speaking with polished emotion about family traditions, holiday dinners, Richard's devotion to those he loved. Eleanor lowered her eyes, not because the words were false, because they were incomplete in a way that felt dishonest. Richard had loved deeply, yes, but he had also known loneliness so profound that once, in a hospital waiting room at 2 a.m, he had confessed he no longer knew whether his family loved him or merely his usefulness. Eleanor remembered the fluorescent lights that night, the untouched vending machine coffee, the way he had stared at his hands instead of her face when he said it. The service ended with quiet movement toward the exit. Outside, black umbrellas opened against a gray sky as mourners prepared for the cemetery procession. Eleanor remained seated until most of the room had emptied. She preferred avoiding crowds, especially hostile ones. But as she rose, a voice stopped her. "You are still here." "Victoria." Eleanor turned slowly. Victoria stood beside the pew with that same brittle smile, now sharpened by curiosity. "I assumed the attorney's strange behavior gave you enough attention for one day." Eleanor answered evenly. "I am here to pay my respects." "That is touching," Victoria said, "but vague." Daniel joined them moments later, his expression carrying less hostility now and more calculation. "Margaret knows you," he said directly. "How?" Eleanor considered him. "I met her through Richard." Victoria laughed softly. "That explains absolutely nothing." "It explains enough." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Were you his employee?" Eleanor did not answer. "A caregiver?" Still silence. Victoria tilted her head. "A charity case?" Daniel exhaled impatiently. "Victoria." "What?" she said. "We are all wondering." Eleanor could have walked away. Instead, she asked a simple question. "Did either of you know he preferred blueberry pie over cake on his birthday?" Victoria blinked. Daniel frowned. "What?" Eleanor held his gaze. "Did you know?" Neither answered. Victoria recovered first. "That proves nothing." "No," Eleanor said quietly. "It does not." She moved past them before either could respond. At the cemetery, the wind had strengthened, carrying the sharp cold of approaching winter across rows of polished granite. Eleanor stood farther back while the family gathered beneath a canopy. Daniel shook hands. Victoria accepted condolences. Several relatives speculated in low voices about board succession, estate administration, and timing. Eleanor watched the casket descend and felt a grief too private to display. Richard had once told her funerals revealed more about the living than the dead. He had not been wrong. After the burial, guests returned to the Langford estate for the formal gathering and will reading. The mansion sat on the north side of the city behind iron gates and bare maple trees, expansive in the way old money liked to be, grand without warmth. Eleanor arrived later than the immediate family, entering through the main doors only because Margaret had specifically instructed staff to admit her. Even then, she felt the scrutiny the moment she stepped inside. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead. Waitstaff moved quietly with silver trays. Family portraits lined the walls like declarations of belonging. Eleanor paused before one image of Richard standing between Daniel and Victoria at a charity gala. All polished smiles. All perfect appearances. Interesting, is it not? Margaret's voice came softly from beside her. Eleanor turned. He looked tired in that photograph, Eleanor said. Margaret's expression suggested agreement. He was. Before Eleanor could say more, Victoria appeared again, carrying a glass of sparkling water and enough confidence for the entire room. Margaret, she said, I hope this mystery guest situation will finally be clarified. Margaret remained calm. The will reading will clarify what needs clarifying. Victoria smiled thinly. That sounds dramatic. Legal documents often disappoint dramatic expectations, Margaret replied. Daniel approached, joined now by his son, Andrew, who studied Eleanor with open curiosity rather than contempt. Dad, the boy asked quietly, who is she? Daniel answered without taking his eyes off Eleanor. No idea. Andrew looked at Eleanor. Did you know Grandpa? Before anyone could stop him. Eleanor nodded. Yes. How? Andrew asked. Victoria stepped in. Andrew, not now. But the boy persisted. Did he work with you? Eleanor almost smiled. Not exactly. Then how? Victoria's patience snapped. Enough. Andrew stepped back. Margaret glanced at her watch. We should begin. Guests slowly gathered in the library, where dark wood shelves and leather chairs created the atmosphere of inherited authority. Eleanor chose a seat near the edge of the room. Victoria remained standing until she found a position clearly visible to everyone. Daniel poured himself a drink he barely touched. The room quieted as Margaret opened the folder. Thank you all for coming, she began. Richard Langford prepared this will personally, with revisions made 6 weeks before his passing. 6 weeks. Eleanor felt the words land heavily. That was after the final hospital stay. Victoria folded her arms confidently. Daniel leaned back. Several relatives exchanged anticipatory looks. Margaret continued through preliminary formalities, naming trustees, administrative procedures, and charitable commitments. Routine. Predictable. Safe. Yet Eleanor noticed something others did not. A sealed envelope, separate from the legal documents, resting beneath Margaret's hand. Richard's handwriting was visible even from across the room. Eleanor recognized it instantly. Her pulse quickened. Victoria noticed her, looking and smiled as if she had discovered weakness. This should be straightforward, Victoria said lightly. Richard believed in order. Margaret lifted her eyes. Did he? Something in her tone changed the room. Daniel straightened. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the envelope in her own lap. And for the first time that day, even Victoria looked uncertain. Margaret adjusted her glasses and began reading the formal allocations in a voice so measured it almost seemed designed to frustrate anticipation. The lake house in Wisconsin was transferred to a family trust. A charitable foundation received a 7-figure donation. Several longtime employees were each named beneficiaries of personal gifts, something that drew murmurs from a few relatives who clearly had not expected generosity to extend beyond bloodlines. Victoria remained composed, but Eleanor noticed the slight tightening in her jaw every time someone outside the immediate family received anything of significance. Daniel leaned back with calculated patience, the expression of a man convinced the larger prize was still coming. Andrew sat quietly beside him, less interested in money than mystery, glancing more than once toward Eleanor. Margaret continued through investment allocations, board instructions, and property management arrangements. The room settled into a rhythm of expectation. Then Victoria broke it. Surely we are getting to the meaningful part. Margaret looked up. That depends on your definition of meaningful. A few relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances. Victoria smiled with brittle politeness. I simply mean family matters. Margaret returned her attention to the document. Richard addressed what he considered family matters very specifically. Eleanor felt the temperature in the room change. Not physically, but socially. like pressure building behind a closed door. Daniel finally spoke. Margaret, with respect, if there are operational details that can be handled later, perhaps we focus on principal distribution. Margaret's tone remained even. Richard anticipated impatience. That earned a brief silence. Eleanor remembered Richard saying almost the same words once after a holiday dinner when he had received 3 separate questions about succession planning before dessert. He had smiled when he said it then, but not with amusement. Margaret turned another page. To my grandson Andrew, I leave my first mechanical watch, with the hope that he learns time is more valuable than ownership. Andrew looked genuinely surprised. Really? He whispered. Daniel managed a small smile. Victoria leaned toward him. That is sentimental. Andrew looked toward Eleanor as though somehow she might explain. His grandfather better than anyone else in the room. Eleanor simply lowered her gaze. Margaret continued. To Victoria Langford, I leave the Palm Beach condominium. Victoria visibly relaxed. Finally, she murmured, not quietly enough. To Daniel Langford, I leave controlling interest in Langford Development, contingent upon governance conditions outlined in Appendix 3. Daniel exhaled through his nose, satisfaction carefully restrained but unmistakable. Several relatives shifted with thinly disguised disappointment, as if recalculating their expectations. Victoria folded her arms with renewed confidence and cast Eleanor a brief, triumphant glance, the kind meant to say there, mystery solved, now leave. But Margaret did not close the folder. Instead, she reached for the separate envelope. Eleanor's breath caught. The handwriting across the front was unmistakably Richard's. Margaret held it carefully, not like paperwork, but like something personal. Victoria noticed immediately. What is that? Margaret answered without looking at her. Instructions. Daniel frowned. Related to the estate? Yes. Victoria laughed lightly. Please tell me this is not another sentimental surprise for the housekeeping staff. No one laughed with her this time. Margaret lifted her eyes slowly. Richard anticipated that certain assumptions would be made in this room. Victoria's smile faded. Daniel straightened. Margaret, this final matter, she said, was to be handled only if one specific person was present. Silence fell hard and complete. Andrew looked around, suddenly alert. Victoria spoke first. Who? Margaret did not answer immediately. Instead, she scanned the room with deliberate calm until her gaze settled on Eleanor. Daniel followed her line of sight. Then Victoria did. For a moment, nobody moved. Victoria gave a short, incredulous laugh. No, Margaret remained still. Yes. That is absurd. Daniel's voice was lower, more cautious. Margaret, who exactly is this woman? Eleanor felt every eye in the room fix on her at once. The scrutiny was almost physical. Margaret placed the envelope on the table but kept one hand over it. Richard was very clear that identities, explanations, and context would be provided in the order he specified. Victoria shook her head. This is ridiculous. We are allowing a stranger to sit in our home while some theatrical reveal unfolds. Andrew quietly asked, Dad, did Grandpa know her better than us? No one answered him. Eleanor sat perfectly still, though inside, memory and grief pressed hard against composure. Richard's final conversation echoed in her mind. Promise me you will stay until the end. Margaret opened the envelope carefully and removed a folded letter. Before I continue, she said, I need confirmation. She looked directly at Eleanor. Miss Hayes, are you prepared for me to read this exactly as written? Victoria turned sharply toward Eleanor, shock giving way to something closer to alarm. Eleanor met Margaret's gaze, swallowed once, and nodded. Margaret unfolded the letter with deliberate care, the kind usually reserved for fragile things that mattered far beyond their material form. No one in the room moved. Even Victoria, who had spent the entire day filling silence with commentary, remained still. Margaret began reading in Richard's unmistakable voice, softened only by memory. If this letter is being read, then Eleanor kept her promise. Eleanor lowered her eyes. Victoria turned toward her sharply. Margaret continued, and if certain members of my family are surprised by her presence, that tells me I understood this room better than they ever realized. Daniel shifted in his chair. Victoria gave a quiet scoff, but it lacked confidence now. Margaret read on. Before anyone interrupts, yes, this is intentional. No, Eleanor is not here by mistake. And yes, some explanations are long overdue. The room had changed completely. What had begun as an orderly estate reading now felt personal in a way none of them had expected. Richard's words continued. My family knows the version of me that built buildings, signed checks, attended galas, and appeared in framed photographs. Eleanor knows the version that sat in silence when the doctors had left the room. Victoria's expression hardened. Daniel's confidence faded into concentration. Andrew leaned forward. Margaret paused only long enough to steady the page before continuing. Many of you will assume Eleanor entered my life recently. Convenient assumptions have always been a family specialty. The truth is much older. Victoria interrupted. Margaret, this is completely inappropriate. Margaret did not even glance up. Richard anticipated interruption as well. She resumed. 22 years ago, on a February night colder than any forecast had predicted, I was not a billionaire. I was exhausted, furious, and more alone than I had ever admitted. Langford Development had nearly collapsed under a disastrous acquisition. Publicly, I remained composed. Privately, I was unraveling. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. She remembered that winter. Margaret continued. I left a board meeting after midnight, walked several blocks in weather no sane person should have been outside in, and ended up in a 24-hour diner because it was the only place still open. I had forgotten my wallet in the office. My phone battery had died. I was standing there, humiliated, when a woman I had never met paid for my coffee and pie without making me feel like a charity case. Andrew looked from Margaret to Eleanor in disbelief. Victoria crossed her arms tighter. Margaret kept reading. That woman was Eleanor Hayes. Silence. Heavy and complete. She did not know who I was. She did not ask. She sat in the booth across from me and treated me like an ordinary human being on a terrible night. We spoke for nearly 3 hours. She told me stories about her mother. I complained about things that sound embarrassingly small now. Before leaving, she said something I never forgot. You can tell who a person is by how they treat someone who cannot offer them anything. Daniel stared at Eleanor as though seeing her for the first time. Margaret continued. Years passed. We stayed in touch. Not constantly. Not publicly, but consistently. Coffee every few months. Occasional calls. Honest conversations, which are harder to find than expensive advisors. Victoria laughed once, but there was no humor in it. This is absurd. Daniel snapped quietly. Be quiet. That startled even Victoria. Margaret read on. When my health began failing, I discovered an uncomfortable truth. Illness has a way of clarifying who visits because they care and who visits because calendars require it. No one spoke. Daniel, I know you loved me in the ways you understood. Victoria, I know appearances matter to you more than you admit. But there were long stretches when hospital rooms grew very quiet. Eleanor looked down at her hands. Margaret continued. Eleanor came without announcement. She brought books I never finished, coffee too weak for my taste, and the rare gift of speaking honestly when others performed concern. Andrew's voice was barely above a whisper. Grandpa never told us. Daniel did not answer. Margaret kept reading. This letter is not punishment. It is clarity. Victoria finally stood. If this is some emotional manipulation, sit down, Daniel said sharply. The authority in his voice surprised everyone, including himself. Victoria sat, furious. Margaret resumed. Because I know my family, I expect assumptions about scandal, secrecy, and inappropriate speculation. Spare yourselves the embarrassment. Eleanor was my friend. One of the truest I ever had. Eleanor's throat tightened. Which brings us to the final matter. I have left Eleanor Hayes a separate bequest, not because she asked for anything, but because she never did. Victoria muttered. Of course. Margaret ignored her. The terms are enclosed in the formal document. She lowered the letter briefly and lifted a legal page. Richard Langford leaves to Eleanor Hayes his private lake cottage in Michigan, unrestricted access to his personal correspondence archive, and a discretionary financial trust in the amount of $5 million. The room erupted, not in shouting, but in overlapping disbelief. Victoria stood again. $5 million? A cousin gasped. Another relative whispered. Who is she? Andrew stared openly at Eleanor. Daniel looked less angry than stunned. Margaret raised a hand for silence. There is more. Victoria laughed in disbelief. There cannot possibly be more. Margaret resumed reading the final lines of Richard's letter. If Eleanor chooses to accept these gifts, they are hers without condition. If she declines, The trust converts into a charitable fund in her name for patient companionship programs in public hospitals. The decision is hers alone. Eleanor had not known that part. Her breath caught. Margaret finished the letter. To my family, if you are angry, ask yourselves whether your anger is about fairness or expectation. To Eleanor, thank you for treating me like a person before the world treated me like an institution. Margaret lowered the page. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Victoria found her voice. This woman manipulated a vulnerable old man. Eleanor looked up slowly. For the first time all day, her calm held visible steel. No, Daniel rubbed his forehead. Victoria, enough. Enough? She snapped. A stranger walks away with millions, and we are supposed to applaud? Andrew quietly asked. If she was a stranger, why did Grandpa trust her more than anyone? That landed harder than anyone expected. Victoria turned toward Daniel for support, but he remained silent. Margaret closed the folder. The allocations are legally valid, fully witnessed, and not open to theatrical interpretation. Victoria glared at Eleanor. Say something. Eleanor looked at the envelope in her lap, then at Richard's letter on the table. Her voice, when it came, was soft enough that the room leaned in to hear it. I did not come here for any of this. Victoria gave a bitter smile. Convenient. Eleanor met her gaze. I came because he asked me to be here. Margaret reached for one final sealed document. There is one additional note, she said. Victoria stared in disbelief. Another one? Margaret nodded once. Addressed only to Eleanor. Margaret held the final sealed note for a moment, then looked directly at Eleanor. Richard instructed that this be given to you privately. Victoria let out a sharp laugh that carried more frustration than amusement. Of course he did. Eleanor stood slowly, her fingers unsteady for the first time all day. Margaret crossed the room and placed the envelope in her hand with quiet care. Richard's handwriting covered the front in familiar ink. Eleanor. Just her name. Nothing else. For a second, the room around her disappeared. She was back in a hospital room with pale walls and steady monitor tones, listening to Richard insist he was not afraid of dying, only of leaving conversations unfinished. Her throat tightened. You can read it later, Margaret said softly. Victoria stepped forward immediately. No, absolutely not. If this concerns the estate, it should be transparent. Margaret's expression hardened. It does not concern the estate. How convenient. Daniel finally stood, exhaustion replacing arrogance. Victoria, enough. She turned toward him in disbelief. You cannot be serious. I am serious, he said. This has already become humiliating. Eleanor almost found the word ironic, but she remained silent. Andrew rose from his chair, eyes fixed on Eleanor with sincere curiosity. Did Grandpa really meet you in a diner? Eleanor looked at him, and something in his expression reminded her of Richard before life taught him to guard every room he entered. Yes, she answered. Andrew blinked. And you stayed friends all those years? Yes. Victoria crossed her arms. Unbelievable. Eleanor looked at her calmly. Not everything valuable happens in rooms like this. That landed harder than Eleanor intended. Victoria's face tightened. Margaret gathered the remaining documents, signaling the formal reading was effectively over, but no one moved toward the exit. The room had become emotionally suspended, as if no one knew the social rules anymore. Daniel finally spoke, quieter now. Why did he never tell us? Margaret answered plainly. Because Richard believed some relationships functioned better without performance. Daniel looked away. Eleanor could see the conflict in him now. Not greed exactly. Something more complicated. Regret, perhaps. A cousin quietly slipped out. Another relative pretended to check messages while clearly listening. Victoria remained exactly where she was, unwilling to surrender the room. I still think this is manipulation, she said. A lonely man forms an attachment, and suddenly millions move. Margaret's response was immediate. Be careful with accusations you cannot support. Victoria opened her mouth, then closed it. Eleanor looked down at the note in her hand. She wanted to leave. More than that, she wanted air. But Richard had asked her to stay until the end. That promise mattered. Daniel surprised everyone by addressing Eleanor directly. What was he like with you? Victoria spun toward him. Daniel. But he ignored her. Eleanor considered the question. Honest. Daniel gave a hollow smile. He was not always that with us. Maybe, Eleanor said gently, because you expected him to be your father before allowing him to be a person. The silence after that felt enormous. Even Victoria did not interrupt. Daniel absorbed the words with visible discomfort because some truths arrived sounding less like accusations and more like mirrors. Andrew asked quietly, "Did he talk about me?" Eleanor's expression softened. "Often." Andrew's eyes widened. "Really? He worried you were growing up in rooms where people discussed success more than kindness." Daniel shut his eyes briefly. Victoria scoffed. "Now we are receiving parenting critiques from a stranger." Eleanor turned to her. "I am not critiquing you." "No," Victoria asked sharply, "because it sounds very much like judgment." Eleanor looked at the note in her hand, then back at Victoria. "You judged me before I said 10 words." Victoria looked away first. Margaret stepped between the tension with practiced professionalism. "I think everyone would benefit from ending this evening with dignity." "Dignity," Victoria repeated. "After this spectacle?" Andrew spoke before anyone else could. "I think Grandpa chose dignity." The room fell quiet again. Daniel placed a hand on his son's shoulder, not to silence him, but perhaps because he did not know what else to do. Eleanor finally moved toward the doorway. "I should go." Margaret nodded. "I will have transportation arranged." "That will not be necessary." As Eleanor reached the hall, Daniel called after her. "Wait." She stopped. He approached with none of the entitlement he had worn earlier. "I do not know what to say." Eleanor answered honestly. "Neither do I." He glanced at the note in her hand. Did he care about us? The vulnerability in the question surprised her. Eleanor thought carefully before answering. "Yes." Daniel swallowed. "Then why this?" Eleanor looked toward the library where portraits watched from the walls. "Maybe because caring and understanding are not always the same thing." Daniel nodded slowly, as if that hurt precisely because it felt true. Eleanor stepped outside into the cold evening air, finally able to breathe. The mansion lights glowed behind her. A car idled near the circular drive, but she ignored it and walked instead, needing distance more than comfort. 2 blocks later, she stopped beneath a street lamp and opened Richard's note. The paper trembled slightly in her hands. His handwriting felt almost alive. "Eleanor, if you are reading this, then I was right about one thing. You stayed, even when leaving would have been easier. Thank you. I know what today may have cost you. I am sorry for that. But there are truths some people only hear when forced to sit still." Eleanor swallowed hard and kept reading. "You once told me kindness without expectation is the purest form of wealth. I spent years pretending I understood that. You actually lived it. I left you material things because the practical world requires practical decisions. But what I most wanted to leave you was acknowledgement. Not private gratitude. Public truth." Eleanor blinked away tears. Cars passed in distant traffic. Wind moved through bare branches overhead. "There is one thing I did not include in the formal reading because it belongs only to you. The lake cottage contains a cedar box in the study. Inside are letters I wrote over the years and never sent. Some are embarrassing. Some are honest. One contains the answer to a question you never asked me, but deserve to know. Read them when you are ready." Eleanor stopped breathing for a moment. She knew exactly which question he meant. Why did he keep their friendship separate from the rest of his life? She continued, "If you choose to reject everything I left, Margaret will understand. That would be exactly like you. But I hope you keep at least one thing. Not for the money. For the reminder that what happened in a diner 22 years ago mattered more than any boardroom decision I ever made." Eleanor pressed the letter closer. The final lines blurred through tears. "One last truth. You saved me long before any hospital room. I was not simply tired that winter night. I was lost in ways success could not fix. Your kindness changed the direction of my life. Whatever my family believes, this was never charity. It was gratitude. Richard." Eleanor lowered the note slowly, overcome not by the inheritance, but by the weight of being understood so clearly by someone no longer there. "Miss Hayes." She turned. Margaret stood a few feet away, having followed at a respectful distance. "I did not wish to intrude." Eleanor folded the note carefully. "Did you know about the letters?" Margaret nodded. "Only generally. He always planned everything." "Not everything," Margaret said with the faintest smile. "You were the one exception he could never quite predict." Eleanor gave a fragile laugh through tears. Margaret hesitated. "There is one more matter." Eleanor looked up. "What now?" "Daniel asked me to tell you he would like to speak again. Not tonight. Someday." Eleanor absorbed that quietly. "And Victoria?" Margaret's expression answered before words did. "Victoria is processing." Eleanor almost smiled. That is a polite term. Margaret's voice softened. What will you do? Eleanor looked down at Richard's letter, then back toward the distant mansion. I do not know yet. But deep down, for the first time that day, she knew exactly one thing. Richard had not brought her there to win. He had brought her there to be seen. 3 weeks later, Eleanor stood inside the lake cottage in northern Michigan, surrounded by cedar walls that carried the faint scent of age, paper, and winter air. Snow rested along the windowsills outside, and the quiet there felt different from the silence she had endured at the funeral. This silence was honest. Margaret had arranged the legal transfer, but Eleanor had delayed coming until she felt steady enough to face what Richard had left behind. The cedar box sat open on the desk exactly where his letter said it would be. Inside were years of handwritten notes, photographs, ticket stubs from concerts he claimed to hate, receipts from diners, and one folded napkin with her handwriting on it from the night they met. You look like a man who needs pie more than pride. Eleanor laughed through tears when she saw it. A knock at the door interrupted her. She opened it to find Daniel and Andrew standing in heavy winter coats, awkward and uncertain in the cold. Daniel held no gift, no legal paperwork, no performance. I hope this is not inappropriate, he said. Eleanor stepped aside. Come in. Andrew immediately looked around with quiet amazement. Grandpa really came here. Often, Eleanor said. Daniel took in the room slowly, seeing parts of his father he had never known. Margaret said you might be here. Eleanor nodded. Silence stretched, but this time it was not hostile. Daniel finally spoke. I read the hospital visitor logs. Eleanor looked at him. And he exhaled. You were there more than we were. Eleanor did not answer. He looked down. That was difficult to learn. Truth usually is, she said gently. Andrew wandered toward the desk, then stopped. Dad says Grandpa left you the trust too. Eleanor smiled faintly. Yes. Are you keeping it? Andrew asked with the direct honesty only young people still possessed. Daniel began to apologize, but Eleanor shook her head. It is a fair question. She walked to the desk and picked up a document already prepared. I made a decision yesterday. Daniel frowned. What kind of decision? Eleanor handed him the papers. His eyes moved quickly across the page. Patient Companionship Foundation? Eleanor nodded. The trust transfers into a non-profit support program for people sitting alone in public hospitals. Andrew looked up. All of it. Almost all, Eleanor said. Daniel stared at her. Why? Eleanor glanced toward Richard's letters. Because he was right. Kindness matters most when nothing is expected in return. Daniel shook his head slowly, stunned. After how my family treated you? Eleanor met his gaze calmly. That says more about them than it should about me. Daniel looked genuinely ashamed. Victoria would never understand this. Eleanor gave a small, knowing smile. Maybe not yet. Andrew stepped closer. Did you keep anything? Eleanor looked toward the desk and lifted Richard's old mechanical watch. One thing. Andrew smiled. Daniel's voice softened. He would have liked that. Eleanor looked out at the snow-covered lake. I think he would have liked this conversation even more. For the first time, Daniel smiled without defense. Not because everything was repaired, but because something honest had finally begun.